For today's book talk video, it's a magical Monday, and I'm going to talk to you about the book Piranesi by Susanna Clarke with the disclaimer that this book might not actually be a fantasy story. But I'm doing it on Magical Monday anyway because it presents itself as a fantasy story. And that alone is something interesting to think about. When you hear the title of the book, you might think that this is about Giovanni Battista Piranesi, the somewhat famous, maybe famous, Italian artist who was born in 1720 and lived until 1778, known as a classical archaeologist, architect, and artist. He's famous for his etchings of Rome, which had some fictitious and atmospheric prison elements to them. If you look at the Princeton University Art Museum website, you can find the collection of his imaginary prisons drawings. And let me tell you, they look amazing. If you like M.C. Escher, it has kind of an M.C. Escher quality to it. But this concept that there was an architect and artist named Piranesi who created a collection known as Imaginary Prisons should be some really great information to help you to dive in to this novel, which I guess I will say, to make it clear, is not about that Italian historical figure. It's not about the artist. In the story, you've got a man who is journaling, who seems to be trapped in this strange maze-like building, manor, mansion, or home, and there are all these weird clues about what's going on, but it doesn't really seem to make sense, which is why it comes across as a fantasy story, that perhaps there are these dimensions, other planes, or dimensional pockets, demi-planes, sort of a concept that you would get from comic books or from role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons, that kind of stuff, and that people can slip into or out of these other worlds or realities or dimensions or planes, whatever that you want to call them. And this man has accidentally ended up in one of these places. The clues in his journal seem to hint at the fact that he may have been kidnapped or tricked, and that he's part of some sort of experiment, sort of like a rat in a maze, a mouse in a maze, how scientists study them and see their reactions to things. There's a character that he interacts with who gives him warnings and tells him what to do and what not to do. And then there's this mysterious other character who's out there in the maze, and part of the intrigue of the story is he's trying to figure out whether that person is friend or foe, whether that person's dangerous. Meanwhile, there are these fascinating descriptions of various statues that are in the maze and the way that the water comes and goes from the maze. I personally doubted the reality of this situation because the author talks about all these vestibules in the place, and to me, a vestibule is part of an entryway or exit, so that if this character saw a lot of vestibules, the character should have been able to find an exit to leave. There's a part where this person describes a window in a room, and I thought, well, if there's a big window there, why can't you escape out the window? And if the water's coming and going, and you seem to be following the water at times, narrator, then why can't you find your way out with the water? To me, it very much seemed to embody the idea of perhaps what the Italian artist was talking about, of an imaginary prison. And so the story ends up being a story that is open to interpretation. And I hate to give you spoilers at all, but my interpretation might be somewhat spoilery, because my interpretation is that this was not a person in a fantasy reality who was stuck in another dimension and had to escape somehow. My interpretation of the book is that it's more of a mental health study, that it was a person who had a mental breakdown and either was living kind of like a homeless person out at a beach area and avoiding dangers and unsure how to interpret the world anymore, or a person who had a mental breakdown and was being studied in a facility. And the story leaves it completely open to interpretation. You might read it and think that it's a fantasy story. You might read it and think that it's about a person who had mental health issues, or you might read it and think something entirely different. I had the joy of reading this as part of a book club, and unfortunately I arrived late to our virtual meeting talking about the book, but it was clear that the book club was divided in interpretations, with a lot of people taking different avenues to approach the story. Someone in the book club did point out that there was a lot of C.S. Lewis Chronicles of Narnia symbolism with the names and the stuff that's mentioned in the stories. I gave the story 4 out of 5 stars. I think Susanna Clarke did a great job with the narrative. I do highly recommend the book. I hope you've enjoyed today's book talk. Every day is a good day for a book talk. Peace.